All right, we're gonna get started. Thanks everyone for being here today. So in 2017, which is now 6 years ago, crazy. In the north parking garage, there were some bushes that were overgrowing this patch of sidewalk. And if you were to walk and see what was behind those bushes, you would find this plaque. What is this plaque and how did it get there and why is it not there anymore? We're gonna get into that. So you guys should have had a session in PNS or in LC related to the Cincinnati radiation experiments, which was something that we helped design. Basically, to give a little bit of background, the Cincinnati radiation experiments were started in 1960 by Dr. Eugene Sanger at the Cincinnati General Hospital. They were irradiating the entire body of cancer patients that they recruited into the study, but many of the patients did not sign consent forms. Many did not know that they were being a part of the study. And many had cancers that were deemed radio resistant, so like not actually considered treatable by whole body radiation. In 1964, they started doing bone marrow transfusions on these patients, and in 1971, the last patient was irradiated for the study. And that was in part due to the Washington Post reporting on radiation experiments being funded by the government, specifically the Department of Defense. And faculty here at the University of Cincinnati, including Dr. Martha Stevens, who was a professor of English, who wrote a report to try to stop these experiments and expose what was happening. So the university ended up terminating the experiments, but in the 90s, some renewed interest began after President Bill Clinton released documents to the public exposing what was happening with a lot of the Department of Defense funds. And that was when a lot of the victims of the experiments realized that, and the families of the victims in the experiments realized that what they were a part of and joined together to file a class action lawsuit that was later settled. And the plaque that we saw here was a result of that settlement. So
last year we started medical school and we learned about this, and we were all really surprised because we didn't know this was happening or happened at our institution. We were lucky enough to have an undergrad give us a big presentation on this, which you guys didn't receive. You guys just read the book, Medical Apartheid, and then you did the PNS assignment. So we made this club to basically hope to spread awareness on the Cincinnati radiation experiments, both within UCOM and to the greater Cincinnati area. And also advocate for a new memorial that actually justly, accurately, and respectfully acknowledges the victims of the CREs. Oh. Did you put this in?
Yeah, I did. So one of the things that we also worked on last year was there is a Eugene L. Sanger Fund that was established in his name from his endowment to the university that is given out by the Department of Radiology. And on the website, there was hardly any mention of his role in the experiments. There was basically no acknowledgement that like something terrible had happened to these people. And so we worked with the department to try to edit the website basically to at least say something. So they took it down, but that's still, you know, something that could be improved upon.
So yeah, when we started medical school, the actual memorial was not even up. Previously it was facing a parking garage, which, you know, no one really saw it in general, but then when we started medical school, they were doing construction, so it wasn't even up, which technically was part of their lawsuit settlement, was to have this memorial up. As of August, they put it up near the new emergency room, which is by a staff entrance.
I believe.
She has found it, but it's not quite easy to get to anyways, still. And the main thing here is that it's inaccurate. So there's only 70 names of the victims here, and the majority of them are not Black patients. They're actually white patients. So again, we would like to advocate for a new memorial that actually accurately represents the victims of the Cincinnati radiation experiments. And so in orange here, you can see where the previous memorial was and now the new one that they put up by the emergency department.
Yeah, so today we have with us here Dr. David Egilman. He is a professor of family medicine at Brown University, actually. But he spent over 30 years as an expert witness and has given depositions and testimonies in more than 600 cases, not just for the Cincinnati radiation experiments, but also, for example, the talc and baby powder that was part of the Johnson & Johnson suit. So he has testified at ACRE regarding the CREs, and the ACRE was a committee that was started by President Clinton to investigate all of these radiation experiments and all the other experiments that were being done by the Department of Defense. And Dr. Egilman has also wrote numerous papers on medical ethics. So we're very glad that he can join us over Zoom today and this is one of the paper he wrote, which is very interesting. I think this is the one we sent out, or we can send this out after this talk. But yeah, so I just want to leave the majority of time for Dr. Egilman to talk about his background, how he came to testify at the trials, etc. So Dr. Egilman, if you could just take, it's all yours.
I take over the screen share, just like,
Yeah. Here, let me allow screen
I
share.
got it.
Okay.
let's see if I can. Just so I cover everything. And I'm gonna try to do learned lessons. You can only learn in any lecture, you may pick up 1, 2, or 3 facts. I tell my students at the beginning of the course, I'm not going to teach them anything. But I hope that by the end of the course, they'll learn how to ask the right question. Since if you don't ask the right question, you can never get the right answer. So these are my disclosures. Brown is now called the Warren Albert School of Medicine. Warren Albert made money by running extra marts. Most of his profits came from selling cigarettes. I think I'm the only one in the Brown faculty that gives this conflict statement. I'll give you the one they really want. I've worked as an expert witness at the request of injured plaintiffs, talc powder, asbestos, diacetyl, that's butter flavored popcorn, Vioxx, metal on metal hip implants, and in the large opioid litigation. Brown University does not fund or authorize or approve of my research. Brown does not stand behind my research or want in any way to get near it, actually. And they have on 2 or 3 occasions successfully killed my course on corporate corruption. Basically, I do research on corporate corruption science in a variety of areas. So let me explain how I got to be involved in opening my mouth about the Cincinnati experiments. Fortunately, it's a long story, but I'll tell it pretty quickly. My father was in a concentration camp. When he came here, he worked in a shoe factory. I also worked in that shoe factory. By some mistake, Brown let me into the 7-year med program. I can assure you they think it's a mistake now, but it was certainly a mistake then. So I came to medicine from a very uncultured position. I was an outlier in many ways. By that I mean, and the reason I think most of the people working on this are women, is that I had experienced a difference in my life experience and the bullshit the society puts out about fairness, work hard, you'll be successful, etc. So like the women running this and any minorities, I got to experience firsthand the difference between what really goes on and the dominant ideas in the society. I ended up in Cincinnati because I was at NIOSH doing a 3-year program of the National Institutes of Health called the Epidemiology Training Program. While I was there, just a little bit extra on the history, this in 72, these experiments first hit national press coverage. Kennedy brought them to Senate hearings, but around that time, he killed Mary Jo Kopechne in an auto accident and then dropped most of his public outgoing stuff. Tuskegee also happened in the 70s. So Kennedy led the investigations of both, but dropped them in an active way. They came up again in 84, 85, when Markey, who was a congressman from Massachusetts, held hearings about them. That was the first time I think the Buchenwald memo came out. Ironically enough, probably my father spent some time in Buchenwald. That memo was a contemporaneous memo in 1952, written by one of the researchers named Hamilton, who said that the experiments that were going on started in 1945. This is a 52 memo, had a little bit of a Buchenwald touch, in that they should be used, even if they used prisoners, they would be unethical. Maybe we should think about non-human primates. Instead, they went to other vulnerable populations in Cincinnati, minorities primarily, or people with terminal, not really terminal cancer, people who had inadequate cognitive skills, which was part of the study. So they proved that the people in the study could not give informed consent. Never mind that they didn't, nobody gave informed consent. Not only did they not give informed consent, the purpose of the research was to determine what would happen to soldiers in a nuclear war in the battlefield. So the patients were treated on their side in a fetal position, pulling their knees up towards their chest, as if their back would face the nuclear explosion. And they were irradiated through the back. That is not how radiation is given for a therapeutic means, because radiation is dispersed as much as possible from around the body and targeted on the tumor. As part of the instructions for the nurses, they were told not to offer medication for nausea and vomiting, because part of the experiment was to determine how much nausea and vomiting the radiation would cause. Martha had been unable to get any physicians to do any analysis from 1972 until I got involved, of the medical records, some of which she had procured. So I had contacts. I had started in Cincinnati with some other people, Committee on Occupational Safety and Health, which is a professional community partnership around occupational health and safety. Some of those people knew of these experiments, and they put me in touch with Martha. And then I volunteered to help Martha put the stuff together. Nothing really happened again until the third hit was in 94. In 94, some of the people working with the unions were doing research on these experiments, and they got the Buchenwald memo from the library somewhere in Tennessee at Oak Ridge University. They took that, and then I gave it to the New York Times. There was a story about it in 94. If I can share again, I can show you maybe those stories. Okay. Just so you see, this is a January 5th, 1994, and they talk about it coming up in 96 before, and they talk about the radiation experiments. And then they did a story on it, and that was the editorial relating to the story. So let me go back to try to turn that share off. So that's a little bit about, now I got involved in 94, again, as a volunteer. There are no physicians in the United States who are working on exposing this, but for me. I can only explain that by the story of the kid who said the emperor had no clothes, and my own personal background. But for some reason, I was the only one criticizing experiments, writing articles about the experiments, and fighting with the unethical ethicists who were made in charge of the ACRE investigation in 94. By the way, as a rule of thumb, I've never met anyone as unethical as bioethicists. And that is because they understand ethics and they go against basic fundamental principles. They did not suggest punishment of any institutions or any individuals because they said, although it was known to be wrong what was done at the time, they invoked the Nazi defense, essentially, that because the institutions had approved it, it was okay to what they did. And why did they do it? Because they all had, Nuremberg Code is 1946. The Nuremberg, that was a US trial, not an international trial. So the Nuremberg Code is really US law, which resulted in the hanging of several Nazi physicians for doing experiments, which we did some similar experiments during World War II, by the way, in US prisons. We did some of the exact typhus experiments the Nazis did in US prisons. Also not well publicized. So why we had big fights with the ethicists who decided that not only should there not be an apology to these people, but that the people who still had not been told that they were unwitting victims of secret experiments not be told. That committee said the government should not tell the people, for example, the women in Vanderbilt who were given radiation cocktails and told it was vitamins in order to determine the transmission of radioactive material to the placenta and their babies, that they were experimented on, and that their children maybe could get thyroid exams, not invasive, easy to maybe pick up an extra thyroid cancer, which the radiation oncologist on the committee said they were increased risk for. They said they shouldn't still be told. So that was a cover-up of a cover-up. Just amazing. Now, Clinton, of course, when they had the presentation, the first thing he did was apologize, ignore the recommendations of Ruth Faden very prominent bioethicist, who went on a campaign with their results. First campaign stop was the Boston Globe. And I had been talking to one of the reporters who met with her because they were trying to justify their non-apology. And they made this criteria out of whole cloth that you had to be harmed in order to justify an apology. Okay. The only people they said were harmed were the people who had plutonium injected into their bodies. And none of these people had been proven to have gotten cancer, etc. Of course, there was never a study, there was never a follow-up, so they really weren't studies, you see. University of Cincinnati never did any follow-up on these. If it was research on cancer, you do a couple of months of follow-up, maybe lifetime of follow-up, and do any kind of proof it was a military experiment, not a medical experiment. But anyhow, Clinton apologized, but still nobody had compensation from the committee. Some people, pardon me, except for some of the plutonium victims, all of whom had died. So they got posthumous apologies. I encourage you to watch Elmarine Whitfield's testimony at the congressional hearings in '94. It's on C-SPAN. It's the most moving testimony of any victim I've ever heard. It's unbelievable. And I gave it to the students. They have it. They can give you that link. Okay, so that's what happened. Now let me try to screen share again and maybe try to explain a little bit about why it happened or why these things happen and what your responsibility is to make them not happen anymore. First is, of course, to let people know about them. Okay? Something called groupthink. This goes to the researchers and also the ethicists on that unethical investigatory panel. Okay? What is groupthink? It occurs when a group makes faulty decisions because of group pressure to lead to deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment. A guy named Irving Janis wrote a book called Groupthink about the Bay of Pigs invasion. A lot of the groupthink applications are actually about political mistakes in interventions. Symptoms: collective rationalization, illusion of vulnerability. There's a lot of them. You can go read the book. It's basically goes back to the kid who wouldn't call out the emperor. Okay? But so these are some things that happen. I'm not going to go through them all. But there are remedies. When you're making group decisions, and this applies to tumor boards just as much as anything else, at least one member should be given the role of devil's advocate to question assumptions and plans. This should be part of everybody's major decision making. And then a couple other smaller things you can remember. If you remember one or two things from this talk, it'll be a big success. The leader should assign the role of critical evaluator to one member, and the leader should avoid stating preferences and expectations. And there's a bunch of other things you can do, but you'll never remember them if I list. So at any rate,
I just want to interject so we have enough time for
I'm
questions.
going to stop now.
Okay, perfect. So I for those of you who are here, so after the experiments became publicized, there was actually two investigations. One was an ad hoc committee that was from the University of Cincinnati itself, and the other one was from the American, I think it's like Association of ACRE, which stands for American College of Radiology or something. So they were considered leading experts at the time, and they all reviewed Singer's protocols and they all actually gave pretty favorable reviews of the experiments. So I guess one of the questions we had for Dr. Egilman is, a lot of the so-called leading experts at the time were not speaking out against the experiments. So how are you able to block out the rhetoric around you and not only come to your own conclusions on the experiment, but also have the confidence to speak out against the experiment? That was one of the questions that was sent to us.
Well, as you can see, I've been an outlier since I was 16. So it's not an unusual position for me, in a variety of ways. So that's a personal thing. But the people, and this is true, that two of the radiation people on the committee had published papers with Sang, and they didn't recuse themselves. That's on the president's advisory committee. So I wasn't a radiation oncologist. I had to go back and do my own research. I did it based on the data that Martha had got. That ad hoc committee was junior faculty. 72, you remember, this is like Kent State just happened. A lot of Vietnam stuff, women's movement starting to happen. You've got more. You've got a lot of continuing advocacy around getting to vote. Okay. So there's a lot of things going on in the society at the time. So that was why the faculty that was an unofficial junior faculty, non-tenured group, but they couldn't get a physician to work. So they lost some credibility in being able to make the medical criticisms that I could make based on my review of the records and my knowledge of the tumors. Because most of the tumors had already been experimented on, and with published experiments, with showing that radiation didn't work on them at all. And that was in the medical literature. Sanger was a prominent person. He was friends with those people. People do not attack their friends easily or criticize them readily. So that's what happened with the ACR thing, and it happened with the ACRE thing.
So it sounds like
It's not easy
mm-hmm.
to call out the emperor. You have to be willing to put yourself at risk. People don't want to do that. And I can understand why that is. It is uncomfortable. You get unbelievable pressure put on. You can get fired. It's no fun.
To jump off of that, I think we also had another question on, as a physician thinker, how can you make sure moving forward that in your own research, as well as in the research in other people's research you participated in, you can continue making sure that you're following ethics and medical ethics, and as well as research ethics?
Well, first of all, you've got to know the mistakes that happened in the past. You've got to be careful about group processes. And you've got to there are rules. You got to make sure those rules are followed, but not just by checking the boxes. You have to make sure the spirit of those rules is followed. And that's not easy. In no experiments that I'm aware of do people encourage the subjects to tape the information given to them about the risks of the experiment. And everybody's got an Apple phone or another phone. And anybody who say, you may want to tape this so you can go home, listen to it again. If you have any questions, come back. That should be standard practice in getting informed consent. It's non-practice. And it's non-practice because everybody understands that the risks of all these experiments are not fully explained and not adequately explained. Because if they were, these meetings would be recorded so that people and their families could listen to it later under less pressure, come back and answer questions. That's a simple intervention. You raise that as a possible intervention in an experiment you're doing or participating in, you will not be seen to be positively viewed by your peers. They'll say, well, maybe someone will use that to sue us because we omitted something. Well, maybe something shouldn't be omitted.
Thank you. We just want to open the floor. Do you guys have any questions, either on what's like being an expert witness or about the Cincinnati radiation experiments?
Oh, I should tell you, I make a lot of money testifying. A lot of money.
Yeah, what's their question?
I was gonna ask, like, could you speak about the financial incentives or
I
lack?
can't hear you, so
Can you speak up,
You can
just repeat the question.
yeah,
So can you speak about the financial incentives that sort of be led or promoted the radiation experiments in Cincinnati?
can you speak about the financial incentives that might have led to or promote the Cincinnati radiation experiments?
I don't think it was financial. I think it was prestige. For the most part. You know, they got their research funded, but they didn't make a lot of money. They made their usual salary, I'm sure. I don't think in any of the experiments anybody made a lot of money. By the way, you may look at what happened in Philadelphia at UPenn in the Holmesburg experiments. And these were, again, African-American prisoners who were used as guinea pigs in skin experiments for corporations for a variety of products. It took a long time. There's a book about it called Acres of Skin. And that's because the dermatologist who's famous, when he first walked in to do a consult in the prison, said, all I could see was acres of skin. You know, like a farmer seeing acres he could plow. So that's what those prisoners were in. At any rate, that university, after many, many years, took his name off of awards and apologized just within the last year or two. And those experiments went on during a similar time period. So that took a huge fight over 20 years. And it's ironic. I met the author of that book because there was a meeting at Brown, because there were people at Brown who were trying to loosen the regulations that prohibited experiments on prisoners. They wanted to, again, and there's a major moves still in the United States to allow experiments on prisoners. Their argument is, if you're in a research project, you do better for HIV, etc. That's certainly true because particularly Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, they don't give multiple cocktail HIV treatments to prisoners. And they don't treat them with hepatitis C medications because they're expensive. But I don't think the solution is to make them guinea pigs in research projects. That's just my view.
Yeah, to touch on that specifically, so Sanger actually submitted a proposal to the Department of Defense. It was unsolicited. So I think there's actually a bunch of documents down at our archives, the Wiley Center. And you can see there's a lot of contention afterwards about whether the patients should have been told that the funding came from the Department of Defense. And it's to some degree, this debate is still going on today because a lot of our funding, a lot of our research here is actually still funded by the Department of Defense.
That's true everywhere.
That's true. Yeah, researchers just have to gather money where they can, you know. Any other questions? You guys have any questions?
I guess, I had a question, so what was like the immediate reaction to the Buchenwald paper? From the community, like, I guess in the medical community?
Zip, nothing. Remember, there were 3 or 4 papers in that issue. I had them reprint Elmarine Allen's testimony and publish it. And then I published another paper, which was a critique of ACRE. I wrote a letter to, because after the ACRE thing was published, the Kennedy School of Ethics, which is where Faden was, did a puff piece journal all about how great that report was. So one of the puff piece specifically on the report was written by a guy named Beecham. Beecham was Ruth Faden's husband. Okay. That was not mentioned in the article. So I wrote a letter to the editor saying, you know, if you're married, actually, if you're married, I called him up first. I said, well, you know, don't you think you should mention that the guy writing this article is married to the woman whose work he's praising? I said, well, everybody knows they're married. I said, well, I'm part of everybody. I didn't know. The people in the ethics community knew because they'd written a big famous book together about bioethics. So that just would have meant they were co-authors because she didn't change her name. But I guess in the business, you knew they were married. So I thought it was pretty funny because I said, look, if you're married to somebody, I try to explain it to them. Then if you're getting along with somebody and you like them, you're more likely to be favorable. And then if you're married to someone and you're not getting along, you might be unfavorable. And then if you're in a marriage, you can't be neutral. If you're neutral about someone in a marriage, there's something wrong. It's inconsistency because you're married to someone. So you can't be a neutral arbiter. Impossible. And they rejected the letter. I bought a $1,000 ad to have it published in the inside back cover. They took my money. They caught it before it went out, and they refused to publish it as a paid ad. I can assure you there were no 4-letter words in it. It was all about the conflicts of a marriage. I thought it was a pretty funny letter too.
Yeah, I know you guys might have classes later, so I just want to jump in really quick before you guys go. So the Martha that Dr. Egilman mentioned was Martha Stephens. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of her yet, but she's actually they might have mentioned her in medical apartheid, but she's an English professor at UC who actually initially did a whistleblowing on an experiment. And at first, the researchers were very reluctant to have her get her hands on all the research paper, but somehow she managed it. And this is actually a book she wrote. It's called A Treatment, and it detailed all of her process through it. We got this book as part of from MSA funds. So this is for you guys. We're gonna leave this in an R&R if you guys are interested. Feel free to just grab a copy and dig through it. It's a pretty interesting story.
I think we're about to wrap up here. Do you have any closing remarks, Dr. Egilman, for our first-year medical students?
I have a little tidbit, but it would be more than closing, so we'll pass.
Okay, well, we're gonna send out an email after this with some more links if you guys want to watch the testimony that Dr. Egilman referred to, as well as the articles that he wrote about the ACRE committee that we mentioned, as well as the Cincinnati radiation experiments themselves. So we really want to thank you for all coming today. We hope that you learned something, I learned something. So, and if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. There is one last thing. Oops. Well, I guess it's not screen sharing, but there is a talk on October 6th. Dr. Carl Elliott, he's the one who first wrote that blog post about the bushes overgrowing the plaque. He is coming to talk about whistleblowing in like medical experimentation, and it should be really interesting. So we hope that you guys are able to come to that on October 6th. And as well, we are going to be hosting a medical student grand rounds, delving more into the scientific value or lack thereof of the experiments that Dr. Egilman mentioned today. So look out for that as well.
And Carl Elliott's a friend of mine. He's the only ethical ethicist in the country, but he will not introduce himself as an ethicist because it has the same feelings about ethicists that I do.
So yeah, anyways, if you guys have anything else, just, you can email us.
Yeah, if you guys did that LC case already, we'll love to hear some feedback. If you have any and just any questions about what we're doing, we'll be happy to answer them. And thank you so much, Dr. Egilman, for your time.
My pleasure.
The students all say thank you. All right, awesome. We're just gonna end the meeting.